Well, good morning. Is this on? I can't tell from my perspective. It's actually a little too clear. You guys did too good of a job with the sound. Normally I'm echoing back at myself. Well, it's great to be here with you all this morning. The second time around here, yesterday, I shouldn't say last night. My days get blurred. When you travel a lot, your days get blurred. You don't know what you've said and who you said it. So sometimes I will repeat myself, and I apologize for that. But yesterday, I gave the story about how I became a Christian from an Islamic background, how that was a transformation for me. How I saw through what people were able to share with me about the specifics and the substantiation of the gospel, a real hope for transformation. What I want to share with you this morning is how, as a body of believers, as people whose bright young minds are being educated and being soaked and saturated in an amount of knowledge, but also I think some godly teaching, you can become an agent of hope in a weary world. You don't need to look around very long. If you have an app on one of your devices, no one uses those big foldy things with print on them, those newspapers. No one does that anymore, I suppose. You get all your news from your apps on whatever mobile device of your choice. But when you look at that, I have one called News 360, and you look at this, and I pick the topics I want, and I go through, and it shows me the various topics that I want to look at, and I see the headlines, and I read the stories. You don't need to look for very long through that kind of an app before you find out something pretty important, that the world is desperate for real hope. There's stories that are uplifting, but most of them are downers. Most of them talk about, things in the Ukraine or things that are happening here in America, whether it's sort of homegrown terrorism or it's some issue having to do with sexual ethics or a new scientific breakthrough that's leading to very serious ethical questions, or some manner of atrocity that's being committed overseas or maybe even right in our own backyards. This is the world that is weary, but it's also weary of fake hope. It's weary of the offer for fake hope. And I think it's the Christian message, not only the message, but the messengers who are the agents of real hope, of substantial hope. And what I want to do is sustain that for you from a historical perspective, but also from something that is contemporary, something you and I can see and taste and touch and feel right now in our own lives and in the world around us. Now, if history's taught us one thing, is that transformation happens. Nations transform. Empires rise and they fall. Dynasties of influence, whatever it might be, whether it's in China, whether it's in Europe, doesn't matter where it is, they come and they go. Their influences rise and then they wane. That happens all the time. And if we don't think that's the case, we just need to look at America's influence. The greatest country in the history of the world is having a tough time maintaining its influence and its credibility in the world. Transformation happens. Bad things are going to happen, and someone's going to rise to the challenge to either help make it a better world or to hinder that world. Things happen all the time. History tells us that things are going to change. That's going to happen. Mark Twain once famously said that history doesn't always repeat itself, but it does rhyme. I think he's right about that. History does rhyme. You're not going to get the exact same atrocities you had from Nazi Germany. We sort of learned those lessons, but it's rhyming. What happens in Darfur when you have ethnic cleansing there? What happens with the persecution of Christians all across the world? The most dangerous belief to have in the world right now is a firm belief in the gospel. It's dangerous. It is illegal to be a Christian in some countries. It's a tough thing. Worldviews are competing for our attention. The question is this: where can we find agents of hope in a weary world? Who's going to be that agent of hope? Because they're all competing for that hope. All of them are. I don't care what worldview you look at, whether it's a secular worldview or a Christian worldview or an Islamic or whatever it might be. They're competing to be the agents of hope. The rise of ISIS as an example, they are not giving us tons of hope. They're giving us tons of terror, in fact. But they actually believe that if they institute this Islamic State, in their version of what an Islamic State actually is, that'll create some kind of utopian society for the world. You can't disagree with them, otherwise you lose your head. But it's interesting when you look at a secularizationism. I don't mean secularism, I mean secularizationism, the enforced secularity, that your worldview as a Christian is not only not public, but it's bad. That is similar in its radicalness. You have The radicals who say you can't disagree with me, otherwise I lop your head off, but try to be a Christian in an academic setting at a secular university and see how far you get with that. Contrary ideas are suppressed. That is its own form of radicalism. No, it's not violent, at least not in America, but it's there. Someone is competing for our attention. That's the point. We are looking for hope, and the question is, who will we allow to be our hope when the worldviews are out there? Consider, for example, the naturalist worldview. The worldview that there is no God and that we're all here by processes of evolution and physical forces and unguided mutations acting on natural selection. Think about that. That is holding sway and dominant in most scientific circles, although the good news is, the hope, pun intended, is that you're seeing a lot of erosion even among secularists who are beginning to doubt the veracity of the Darwinian model. But it's still quite prevalent. Think about what it's actually saying. In principle, and I was discussing this with some students this morning, in principle, there is no equality on this view. How can there be equality in the Darwinian view? If the Darwinian view is that the stronger, the smarter, the faster will dominate the weaker, the dumber, and the slower, and that will propagate the species more, by definition, equality is an illusion. It is incapable, in principle, of telling us that we have some kind of equality within us. How is that hope? How is that hope for the sick? How is that hope for those who might be born with some kind of a physical challenge that they're trying to overcome, or a mental challenge? How is that hope? On a Darwinian evolutionary idea, those things must be selected out as genetically undesirable. And this is happening in our day, ladies and gentlemen. This is not just me saying this might happen someday. This is happening now. If you were at the apologetics class yesterday, you heard me talk about and mention a couple of ethicists. It's a misnomer because their ethics is so screwy and weird to think that they're actually ethicists. But Princeton University, no slouch of a university, has as the chair of the bioethics department Peter Singer, a philosopher who says that newborn babies are no more worth than that of a pig. Because a pig can at least give you food and can give you something in response to, by virtue of its living. But a baby is just a drain, and therefore what that means is if the parents don't value that baby, they can kill the baby, not a preborn baby, a newborn baby. And he's not alone. Francesca Minerva and Alberto Giubilini, two ethicists out of Australia, they concur. They wrote an article called "Why Should the Baby Live?" where they make an argument that people don't have intrinsic value. In other words, they don't have value in and of themselves. They have what's called extrinsic value. Babies only have value that parents place on them. Otherwise, they have no inherent value. And if the parents don't value them, well, then those kids don't have actual value and they can be exterminated. Is that hope? Is that happening? Now, thankfully, most people who believe in an evolutionary framework don't hold to these kind of ideas. But the point is this: those ideas could not even surface absent an evolutionary framework. It is the logical outworking of that worldview. Thank God most people don't believe this, but it is on the rise. It is happening. These are unthinkable questions, unthinkable statements that we couldn't have even thought of 65, 70 years ago. No one would have made that kind of an argument in an academic journal and been taken seriously. It's funny, Michael Denton, who is himself a biologist, he wrote a book called Evolution, A Theory in Crisis. He says this: the social and political currents which have swept the world in the past 80 years would have been impossible without the theory of evolution's intellectual sanction. The influence of the evolutionary theory on fields far removed from biology is one of the most spectacular examples in history of how a highly speculative idea, for which there is really no hard scientific evidence, can come to fashion the thinking of a whole society and dominate the outlook of an age. A lack of basis scientifically. There are some things we have to wrestle with and understand and learn from our evolutionary scientist friends. But there is this lack of basis, but it dominates an age and causes these questions that were unthinkable 70, 80 years ago. They are competing for your allegiances. Here's the point. Sometimes ideas, as flimsy as they might be, can become socially significant to the point where they dominate the age and they become the agents of hope. If that's our hope, then God help us. But then you look at the postmodern ideas. Thankfully, postmodernism is starting to die its death. It is beginning to die its death. Postmodernism, of course, is the idea that no truths are actually absolute or objective. They're only subjective truths, and that what's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me. And, don't push your views on me. That's a power play. We need to have a conversation, but no actual truth claims. That is thankfully beginning to die its death. On all circles, not just in Christian circles, but in all circles. You have these atheists like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, and these folks, they're not postmodernists. They're not saying that there are no truth claims. They're making very strident truth claims that there is no God. And they're saying religion isn't just false, it's actually bad. That's why Dawkins says people who are religious are either insane or deluded or wicked. That's not a postmodernist statement. So it's beginning to die its death. But you see it still prevalent. You see it, not prevalent, you still see it in places where people don't want to have these uncomfortable conversations about truth. And you begin to share your Christian convictions, for example, and they're like, well, that's fine for you, but I happen to have this belief, and I want to stay where I'm at, and you can stay where you're at, and all that. But you can begin to see the erosion of that, because it's self-defeating. This idea that there are no objective truths, and you must have heard this before. The common refrain. There are no objective truths, only subjective truths. Nothing's true objectively. And of course, the response to that question or that statement is that objectively true? Is it objectively true that there are no objective truths? It's self-defeating. It saws off the limb on which it's sitting. It can't stand up. So these are beginning to die their deaths. And then you have the totalitarian regimes that are also competing for our allegiances. And actually not competing, they're enforcing our allegiance. You must obey what I'm saying. When you look at North Korea, that's a good example of it. But they're not alone. And if we're not careful, we're going to begin to see the erosion of a substantial hope, that we have a hope that's beyond human beings, beyond humanity. And if we erode that, who's going to take the place of that being, that foundation for our hope? If our hope is in God and that's eroded away, who's left? As Protagoras said, humanity is the measure of all things. Humanity will become the foundation for our hope. And when you look at history, you see a hope that is based on the vicissitudes of human opinion. You have holocausts, and then you have rebuilding, and you have slavery, and then you have abolition, then you have human sex trafficking. We're always thinking of ways to break the rules. If we are our hope, ladies and gentlemen, it just sounds desperate. It sounds terrible. In fact, Friedrich Nietzsche, the famous atheist, he was extraordinarily honest. Nietzsche was this wonderfully expressive atheist, and he proclaimed the death of God. He had this death of God movement that happened in the 1960s. Well before that, 100 years before that, Friedrich Nietzsche was saying that God is dead, the German philosopher. And he writes in his book, in his parable, The Madman, how this madman springs into the midst of those who have killed God, and he says, "We are the murderer of all murderers. What sponge have we used to wipe away the horizon? What sacred games do we have to invent to be worthy of the very deed of killing God? He is bled to death under our knives. Must not we become God now to be worthy of the very act we have done in killing him?" See what's interesting about that? What he's saying is that when we jettison God, someone's taking his place. And the only game in town is humanity. That's all that's left. And Nietzsche, though an atheist, he said this, that when we unchain ourselves from our sun, as it were, we will stray like aimlessly through an infinite nothing. It'll become dark in the noon hours, and lanterns will have to be lit in the mornings. Things will be upside down. And he made this prognostication, and it's almost prophetic. He said, when God died philosophically for us in the 19th century, the 20th century will be the bloodiest century in the history of the world. That's what he said. Absolutely correct. We have thought of more ways to kill each other. We have used all of our brilliance and all of our technologies to find ways to kill more of us in a shorter period of time. We have killed more people in our wars in the 20th century than in the previous 19 combined. If humanity is our hope, because God is dead, I don't know if there is an actual hope. How can there be? But these things are not always so black and white. It's not just us versus them. It's not an us versus them thing. Because many of our secular humanist friends, many of our atheist friends, like Nietzsche, actually had a desire to believe in the inherent goodness and the intrinsic value of humanity. They wanted this. The question isn't, do we want it? I'm glad they want it. They want to value human beings. I do too. But my suggestion, ladies and gentlemen, is that you have to have a foundation, a grounding for this. There needs to be a sure foundation. You look at the attempts of the secular humanists, like Jürgen Habermas, for example. Jürgen Habermas is a German social scientist and a social critic. And he says, what we do is we find human value through a shared consensus. We kind of come together as people, we hash out our ideals in a marketplace of ideas, and the right ideas come out, and we derive human value and theories of justice through this mass consensus, and that's how we get there. The problem with that is if you look back, you see there's a very serious problem with the way humans do this. When we jettison God, we don't do a very good job of this. The Stalinist regime killed 20 million people in the name of essentially an irreligious society that they claimed was going to be a utopia one day, but we have to have 20 million deaths in order to get there. Pretty awful. Habermas wants this to be true, and I'm with him on this because I do think there's a shared consensus, but it's quite flimsy. Because anybody can come along, any charismatic figure, any Hitler, any Pol Pot, any Stalin, anybody can come along and say, oh yeah, that's a shared consensus, follow my consensus because I'm the one who's going to lead you around. Happens all the time, all the time. And in fact, in this country itself, we see this all the time. Charismatic figures who come and say something flowery and beautiful, and we come alongside because they have the answers. Because our basis for value and humanity is so flimsy. The basis of our hope is so flimsy. You've seen the movie Gladiator. There's a hint of this. The movie Gladiator, of course, was very loosely based on history. It wasn't remotely, it was only partially based on any kind of real history. But of course, Marcus Aurelius really was an emperor of Rome. And if you remember, there's a scene in that movie where Marcus Aurelius, this aging but wise, sagacious old emperor, is trying to turn Rome into a republic again. And he's talking to Maximus, and he's saying, you are going to be the next emperor. I want you to be the next emperor because you can restore the whisper that was Rome. And he said, the whisper that was Rome was when people came together, had a consensus about ideas, and it was a republic. The people had a voice, but it was fragile, he says. You could just whisper it. Because if you talked too loudly about it, it would just vanish into thin air. It was so fragile. The problem with the shared consensus, this idea that we don't need God to come together and create this hope, that's the whisper, ladies and gentlemen. If you talk about it too loud, it'll just vaporize, it'll fade. You see this in Europe with its secularization. You see this happening. There's an erosion of all those fundamental values that made Europe great. You see that happening. They are the whisper. What is the sure foundation? What can turn these things from a whisper to an actual shout, to something that's worth shouting about? It's a foundation. I firmly believe it's the life, death, burial, and resurrection and eventual return of Jesus that forms that foundation. How do I know this? A couple of ways I know this. Jesus made some very audacious claims. Some very audacious claims to his authority. In John 14:6, he says that I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. It's interesting that he says he is the way, the truth, and the life. Not just I have the truth and I have a great philosophy that will help you in life and you'll get a good society from it. He didn't say that, or just that. That he is the foundation of truth and that he is the life. That is hope. That's a statement of hope. But he also made the statement that he's the only one, no one else. Now that's quite a statement. That's quite audacious. Today it would be considered arrogant. He's the only one to whom we can come for life and for hope. But how can we know that he is the foundation for that? How can we know that? People often ask me this question. Why do you trust Jesus? Now, I came from a background that didn't trust Jesus as my Savior. He was a prophet who said some nice things and some examples for me to follow, but he wasn't my Savior in any sense. But so why did I come to a faith in Christ? People say, why do you believe in Jesus when he says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and that he is the one who has the hope? My answer is very simple, ladies and gentlemen. Christ died on the cross and rose from the dead, and guys who rise from the dead have credibility. Everyone, Jürgen Habermas, Marcelo Pera, all these big thinkers are thinking of ways to give us a utopia. Richard Dawkins and all these folks are trying to tell us the way forward. Every one of them is going to die and stay dead. And some of them are already dead, and they're still there. They're still there. They're still dead. I was sitting on a plane. I was flying to Colorado, and I was sitting next to a guy, and I had my Bible open, and he asked me a question. He said, "Do you take that seriously?" I'm like, well, that's an interesting question. Do I take it seriously? What do you mean by seriously? He says, well, literally. Do you think it's literal? I said, well, it's literal where it intends to be literal. It's figurative where it intends to be figurative, and these kind of things. So, yeah, I take it seriously. He's like, well, I believe that good people go to heaven. I believe in God, but good people get to go to heaven because God rewards those who are good. I said, well, that's an interesting theory. Why should I believe you? Because Jesus didn't say that. He's like, he didn't? I'm like, no. Here, I'll show you. Show him. Right where it's at. I said, so why should I believe you? You're offering me a hope of a salvation based on my works. And I understand why you believe that. Most people believe what you believe. My question is, why should I believe you? I'm not being a jerk about it. We're having a very nice conversation. And he said, well, it just seems intuitive to me. I said, well, it seems counterintuitive to me because if you look at history, we're bad at this. If I could put your thoughts on this screen from the past 24 hours, for everyone to see, how many of you would stay in this room or run out of here in shame? I know I would. I wouldn't be able to show you those thoughts for the past 24 hours. Just my thought life gets me in trouble. How in the world do I think that I'm worthy of the greatest prize there possibly could be? So we had this wonderful conversation. See, the thing he was struggling with was his intuition that he wants to justify himself, and that's his hope. But I was telling him that Christ said he's the only way to salvation, and then he said, well, why should I believe Jesus? And I said, I'm glad you asked. And it happens to be because of the resurrection. See, if Jesus died and stayed dead, how would you know he was right? He said, I've come to die and pay the price for the sins of the world, and that's the future hope. How can you know he was right if he died and stayed dead? You wouldn't know that. Maybe he was right. Probably he was wrong. Because how does he prove it? Unless he didn't stay dead. They asked him that question. Why should we believe you? In John chapter 2, they asked him that question. Who do you think you are? And he said, destroy this body and I will raise it up again in 3 days. He didn't give them an opinion. He didn't give them a nice sounding social idea about how we can engineer our own hope. He gave them a real hope. Either he was going to die and stay dead or die and rise. That either happened or it didn't. It wasn't a matter of opinion. He gave them an objective test for this. That is a tremendous hope. A tremendous hope. So when he says that he is the way, the truth, and the life, I believe him because he rose from the dead. And then I believe not only him, but I believe in him because later on, just 4 verses later, when he says an interesting statement about who he is and what the way, the truth, and the life actually means. He said that truth transforms. Truth is the hope. He says, because if you abide in my word, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. That's the hope. He identifies himself with the truth, and then he says, I am the truth, the way, and the life, and I set you free. That's hope. That's a real hope, and you can see it throughout history, changing the world. You know, the emperor, in the Roman Empire, in the early days of Christianity, there was a Roman Empire, obviously, and people weren't given equality. You weren't given personhood because of your birth. That's not what happened. In fact, that word person comes from the Latin word meaning persona, which means mask. It is something that's put on you by someone. It's artificial. It's outside of you. So you are given personhood not by virtue of your birth, but by the state. Because you either have enough money, you have enough prestige, enough status, enough wealth, you were a soldier, whatever it was, you had to earn personhood from the state. So you weren't all equal before the state, had to be given that intrinsic value. The Christian worldview comes along and changes all of that because it says something really interesting about equality. It says that we are all equally sinners. Every one of us is equally sinners, but we're equally redeemable. And Christ died for the world. That's why when you read John 3:16, people say Christianity is too exclusive. It excludes too many people, and it's so arrogant in its exclusiveness. Interesting statement. Have they not read John 3:16, the most famous verse of the Bible ever? What does it say? For God so loved the world, that's everyone, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever shall believe in him, that's anyone, shall not perish but have everlasting life. It is the most exclusive means of salvation, but given in the most inclusive invitation there is. And that happened in the Roman Empire. And in those early days of the Roman Empire, what happened was a change began to happen. It was Christians who were helping the poor among the pagans. And they were changing their lives for the better. Christians who had this hope, who said, all of us are equally sinners. I'm not better than you. You're not better than me. But Christ is the one who saves us all. They were the ones who were reaching out. Emperor Julian, who was a convert to paganism after he was born in a Christian family, actually lamented this very fact. And he said, the insipid Galileans are winning because they not only care for their own, but they care for ours as well. Caesar and Christ had come to the arena, and Christ had won. The story of Telemachus, the story of the ascetic monk Telemachus, who heard that in the 3rd century, I think it was, the emperor had reinstituted, not the 3rd century, sorry, the 2nd century, had reinstituted the gladiatorial fights. And he was appalled by this. He says, there's no way this could really be happening. So he goes back to Rome to see, and he sees that the fights are happening. He sees the gladiatorial fights, people being treated like meat for the entertainment of the crowds. And he goes to the Colosseum, he jumps the fence, or the gate there, walks into the Colosseum, stands between these two gladiators and says, in the name of Christ, stop this. And one of the gladiators runs him through with a spear. And as he's dying, holding on to that pole through his body, he says again and again, in the name of Christ, stop this. And the emperor, who was in the audience, turned his back. And the entire people turned their back, and they left, and there was never one more fight in the arena. Telemachus knew what Jim Elliot, the famous missionary, knew. He is no fool who gives away what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. That's an agent of hope. If the empire can be changed, then this world can be changed. It was Christians who helped people who were struggling with the plague. When the plague ships came in, it wasn't the others, the non-Christians, who were rushing into those ships to take care of the plague-infested people. It was Christians who did it. They're the ones who rushed in to help because of the hope they had within them. They did not think to themselves that this is, my physical body, I should protect myself and not go help people who are infested with plague. I should go and help them. If I die, I have a greater glory coming in the future. As Paul the Apostle himself said, to die is gain, but to live is Christ. To live is to be self-sacrificial. So they knew their reward was coming, but if they lived through this horrific experience, they would still be living like Christ for the sake of those they were trying to reach out to. It was transformative. It was powerful. It changed an empire, it changed a society. History does not repeat, but it does rhyme. Who are the ones who are going to Africa and helping the Ebola victims? Risking their own lives. It's Christians. It's believers in Christ who are doing that. Who are not seeing this world and this life as something to grasp onto, but are saying, I want to serve others so that they see the light of Christ in me. Now that comes down to something pretty important. When you see the abolition of slavery led by Christians, William Wilberforce, of course, is the most it rhymes like a Dr. Seuss poem, doesn't it? Wilberforce, of course. But he changed the mindset of an entire country so that the despicable practice of slavery would end. And he did that over the course of decades to try to end that, and he did that. But you see the hope that is happening in the world. Let me read to you from something that an atheist wrote, Matthew Paris, an avowed atheist, about the change that's happening in Africa. You might know this, that African aid goes over there, but oftentimes 75 to 80% of it is usurped by warlords and people who are selfish in their ambition, and almost none of it gets to those who really need the help. Matthew Paris goes back to Africa. He was raised there, did some work there. His family did tons of work there. They weren't Christians, I don't think, but they did secular work for charities. He goes back to Africa, and he sees something interesting, and he writes this about his observation. This is an atheist talking. He says, before Christmas I returned after 45 years to the country that as a boy I knew as Nyasaland. Today it's Malawi. It inspired me, renewing my flagging faith in developing charities. But traveling in Malawi refreshed another belief too, one I've been trying to banish all my life, but an observation I've been unable to avoid since my African childhood. It confounds my beliefs, stubbornly refuses to fit my worldview, and has embarrassed my growing belief that there is no God. Now a confirmed atheist, he says, I've become convinced of the enormous contribution that Christian evangelism makes in Africa. Sharply distinct from the work of secular NGOs, governmental projects, and international aid efforts. These alone will not do. Training and education alone will not do. In Africa, Christianity changes people's hearts. It brings spiritual transformation. The rebirth is real. The change is good. Did you hear what he said? Christian evangelism changes Africa. Not Christians doing good things in Africa like everybody else. The message of hope transforms the corrupt and helps them see their sin. They stop being corrupt and they begin to help. That rebirth is real, he says. The change is good. That's the hope that we can see. That's the hope that we can see. Ladies and gentlemen, you are on the cusp of becoming an agent of hope. By the way, don't wait to graduate to be an agent of hope. And I know that you're already doing this. From the announcements we heard today about the things you're trying to do to help out through the sex trafficking industry and trying to put some stops to that and various other things. And I've been seeing the flyers all around campus about the efforts of this body of believers to try to make a difference. You're making a difference now, but as you graduate and you have the responsibilities of your life that come, remember something. You are an agent of hope. Because you believe, at least I hope you believe, in hope embodied, the one who is the very incarnation of hope itself. We who were without hope before now have it. We now have it because we have Christ. Your life is to be as a living sacrifice. That's why Paul says that. It's interesting when you see Paul's statements. He says, for me to die is gain, but to live is Christ. Now he's writing that from prison. And he says he's hard pressed on every side because I don't know which is better, to be dead or to be alive. How many of you can actually say that? But you don't know which is better. See Paul's strength of hope? He says, look, if I die, I go on to be with Christ. That's why to die is gain. But me staying here, he says in that same chapter in Philippians, is better for your account. Because if I go, I'm going to be with the one for whom my soul was made. He wants to be with Christ more than anything else. But he wants to stay, not for his own sake, but for the sake of others. To live is Christ. Christ's incarnation is itself a sacrifice. Before that cross even happened, there was a sacrifice already, and that sacrifice was that he had to live among us. How long must I suffer this generation? Think about what it means to be the pure, holy Son of God, the Son of the second person of the Trinity, who lives in that state of pristine glory and comes and has to deal with you and me. That by itself is a sacrifice altogether. And Paul says, if I go, it's gain, but if I stay, it's to live like Christ. You are to live a life that is like Christ, a life of self-sacrifice. That's what you're supposed to do. And I think you are going to be doing it as I see the energy and the glimmer in your eye. You will be what Paul Lee Tan says a true Christian actually is. He makes this statement. He says, a Christian is a mind through which Christ thinks, a heart through which Christ loves, a voice through which Christ speaks, and hands through which Christ helps. Let's be that mind. Let's be that heart. Let's be that voice. Let's be those hands. Let's be that agent of change. I have about 50,000 quotes I could give you from atheists who have recognized the fact that if you live as a Christian, real change happens. Marcelo Pera is another social critic and commentator and a sociologist who says this, who points out that in fact if we live in this Christian sort of milieu, in this idea of Christianity, real change happens. And I'm going to spare you that long quote. It's worth reading though. But I want to wrap up with a story here to show you something important. Now, before we get too proud of ourselves, I don't want us to think that we are the agent of hope because we're somehow inherently better than everybody else. It isn't that you're better, it's that the one who dwells in you is better, is the source of goodness. So don't get too proud of yourself. It's not Christianity that changes things, it's Christ in us who changes things. He changed you. I pray that he has changed you, and if he hasn't changed you, I pray that that happens before this day is done. That he changed you from the inside so that you can change the world around you. You ever hear the statement? There are 5 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in the life of the believer, and most will never read the first 4 until they see the 5th. Be the agent of change. There's a story about a church years ago. It was on the coast of England, on the rocky cliffs of England, and it had a really tall spire, a very small church, but had a tall spire. And one day it was destroyed in a very, very violent storm. And the church was trying to figure out, should they rebuild or move somewhere else that was less, tenuous of a place, and somewhere that wasn't so given to the winds and the storms. And so the pastor was thinking, we don't have enough money to relocate, nor do we have enough money to rebuild the church. But a admiral in the British Navy comes to him and says, are you going to rebuild that spire? And the pastor says, we don't have the money. We can't do it. We have to move or do something else, but we can't rebuild the church. And the admiral says, if you don't, we will, because that spire on that cross is on all of our maps. By that spire, by that cross, all the ships of the 7 seas find their home. Hold up the cross, hold up the light, and the darkness will flee. Be an agent of change. Be on the map. Charles Spurgeon said a lot of beautiful things, and I'm going to close with this quote, and this is what he says. Set yourself on fire, because men will come from miles around just to watch you burn. I pray that you light yourself on fire as you go through your studies and as you go and you graduate and you take on the world. Light yourself on fire so that men will come around just to watch you burn and burn for him. Thanks so much. God bless you.